Hey everyone, tonight we're cataloguing an entire continent's nightmares. From the blood-drinking Strigoi of Romania to the shape-shifting Selkies of Scotland, we're diving into every creature that has stalked European minds for millennia. Before we begin, hit like if you're ready for the ultimate monster encyclopedia, and let me know in the comments which European creature you think is the most terrifying. Now dim those lights and settle in. We're about to journey through fog-shrouded moors, haunted forests, and cursed mountains to meet every beast, spirit, and demon that Europe ever conjured. Without further ado, let's begin. The wind howls through the mountains of the Alps, carrying something more than snow. In the villages below, children press closer to their mothers' skirts, and the mothers pull them closer still. December darkness has fallen early again, and with it comes the sound every parent dreads. The dragging of chains, the scrape of claws on stone, the wet, snuffling breath of something that should not be. This is the land where winter is not just a season, but a test of survival, where the line between the living and the dead blurs like frost on glass. Here, in the forests and fjords of northern Europe, monsters were born not from imagination, but from necessity. Dark mirrors held up to reflect the deepest fears of people who knew that one harsh winter, one failed harvest, one moment of weakness could mean death for an entire community. The cold breeds its own kind of terror. When the sun disappears for months and the world becomes a realm of shadow and ice, the human mind begins to populate that darkness with shapes that move just beyond the firelight. In these northern reaches, where survival demanded absolute adherence to community rules and ancient wisdom, monsters became the enforcers of order and the embodiment of what happened when that order failed. The church bells of Salzburg ring out across the snow-covered streets, but their bronze voices cannot drown out another sound entirely: the rattle of rusted chains dragging across cobblestones. December 5th has arrived, and with it comes a creature that predates the gentle saint whose feast day it shadows. Krampus emerges from the mountain mists like a fever dream given form. His body towers above the tallest man, covered in matted fur that reeks of sulfur and pine. Curved horns spiral from his skull, framing eyes that burn with the cold fire of winter stars. His hands end in claws that could rend flesh from bone, and his mouth splits into a grin that reveals teeth like broken glass. Behind him drag the chains he has worn since the world was young, each link forged from the screams of children who forgot their place. But this is not merely a monster, this is a tool. In the villages that cling to the alpine mountainsides, where avalanches can bury entire communities and a single selfish act can doom everyone to starvation, the Krampus serves a purpose more practical than spiritual. Parents invoke his name not from cruelty, but from desperate love. "Be good," they whisper to their children as the winter wind rattles the shutters, or Krampus will come. The old Germanic word krampen meant claw, and claws are what Krampus brings to bear against the chaos that threatens community survival. In societies where every mouth must be fed through the lean months, where every piece of firewood must be shared, where every rule exists because breaking it means death, the Krampus becomes the embodiment of consequence itself. Watch him prowl the streets on his night, his birch switches crackling like fire. The good children receive nuts and apples from St. Nicholas. The disobedient ones feel the sting of Krampus's rod, or worse, find themselves stuffed into his wicker basket, carried screaming into the frozen wilderness, where their cries join the eternal howl of the winter wind. This is not random cruelty. This is social engineering wrapped in fur and chains. The Krampus exists because sometimes love is not enough to ensure survival. Sometimes fear must do what affection cannot. And when the Krampus retreats to his mountain caves with the coming of dawn, other things stir in the northern darkness. Far across the frozen waters, where the Viking longships once carved their names into legend, a a different kind of horror rises from the earth itself. The burial mound on the Norwegian hillside should be peaceful, should shelter the sleep of heroes who earned their rest through blood and glory. But the dead do not always cooperate with the living's plans for them, and some corpses refuse to embrace the silence of the grave. Inside the cairn, Grettir the Strong opens eyes that should be sealed forever, and they burn with a blue fire that has nothing to do with life. His flesh has not rotted. Death has transformed it into something worse, swelling his body to twice its living size, granting him strength that no mortal frame could contain. His skin has taken on the color of old bone, stretched tight over muscles that bulge with supernatural power. When he moves, the burial chamber fills with the stench of decay and seawater, of things long dead that refuse to acknowledge their condition. He is Draugr now, neither living nor properly dead, but something caught between states, like ice forming on a winter pond. The Norse knew this word, knew its weight. Draugr, literally after-walker, the one who walks after death, should have claimed him. But why does he wake? Why does he claw his way from the burial chamber that should be his eternal rest? The answer lies in the world above, where the living have forgotten their obligations to the dead. Perhaps his family has not honored his memory with proper sacrifices. Perhaps his enemies have spoken his name with mockery rather than respect. Perhaps most terrifyingly of all, there is some deed left undone, some treasure unguarded, some oath unfulfilled that anchors his spirit to this realm of shadow and pain. The Draugr rises because death is not an end but a transformation, and not all transformations are peaceful. He possesses strength that can crush stone, the ability to change his size from giant to small, and the power to enter dreams and drive men mad with visions of their own mortality. He can swim through solid earth as easily as water, and his touch brings frost even in summer's heat. In the archaeological record, we find the proof of how seriously the Norse took this threat. Graves weighted down with stones heavy enough to crush a bear, bodies decapitated and the heads placed between the feet, iron spikes driven through corpses to pin them to the earth. These were not the practices of a superstitious people. These were the desperate measures of those who knew that death was not always final, and that some sleepers must never be allowed to wake. But even the Draugr's terrible presence pales beside the horror that visits the living in their most vulnerable moments. In the darkness of a Saxon farmhouse, as the wind moans through the thatch and the fire burns low in the hearth, Elfric the farmer lies paralyzed in his bed, his breath coming in short gasps as something unseen settles onto his chest like a stone. His eyes move frantically in their sockets, taking in every detail of his familiar chamber. The rough wooden beams above, the dying embers in the hearth, the familiar shape of his wife sleeping undisturbed beside him. But he cannot move, cannot speak, cannot even draw a full breath as the weight on his chest grows heavier. She is there, though he cannot see her clearly. The mare has come riding through the night on her mission of torment, slipping through keyholes and between the cracks in reality itself. Sometimes she appears as a woman, pale and beautiful, with hair like spun moonlight, and eyes that hold the cold depths of winter lakes. Sometimes she is a horse, with a coat black as the space between stars, her hooves making no sound as they carry her across the dreaming world. Always, she brings the weight, the crushing sensation that steals breath and hope in equal measure. The Old English word mare speaks to something fundamental and terrible. The nightmare, the female demon who rides sleeping victims like horses, stealing their breath and peace for her own dark purposes. She is sister to the Germanic mare and the Scandinavian mara, all branches of the same ancient tree of terror that grows in the soil of the sleeping mind. But the mare is more than a simple tormentor. She represents every fear that comes with vulnerability, every terror that multiplies in the darkness when consciousness fades and the barriers between worlds grow thin. She enters through any opening, keyhole, crack in the wall, the gap between door and frame. Once inside, she settles onto her victim's chest and begins to ride, using the sleeper's body as her mount in a gallop across the landscape of dreams. Some say she comes seeking secrets, pressing deeper into the mind with each labored breath until she has extracted every hidden shame and private fear. Others claim she feeds on the terror itself, growing stronger with each racing heartbeat, each desperate struggle against paralysis. The protection against the mare reveals her true nature. Iron scissors placed beneath the pillow, their cold metal forming a barrier she cannot cross. Salt scattered on the windowsill, its purifying properties creating a line she dare not breach. Most effective of all, a tarred rope placed around the bed, for the mare, like all creatures of obsession, must count every fiber before she can pass, and dawn will always arrive before she completes her counting. She is compulsion given form, the embodiment of obsessive behavior that traps both victim and predator in endless, self-defeating cycles. The mare rides still, though we know her by other names now. Sleep paralysis, night terrors, the crushing anxiety that settles on the chest in the small hours when worry takes physical form. She is proof that some monsters are not conquered but merely renamed, their essential truth remaining unchanged across centuries of human experience. And in the spaces between her visitations, where the mist rises from the moors and the old Roman roads stretch empty through landscapes that time forgot, something else watches. The old road through the Yorkshire moors should be empty at this hour, its stones worn smooth by centuries of travellers who will never walk this way again. But in the mist that rises from the heather, something moves that is larger than any hound that ever drew breath, its shoulders reaching the height of a man's waist, its fur so black it seems to drink the moonlight rather than reflect it. This is the black dog, known by a dozen names across as many counties. In Yorkshire, they call him Padfoot, for the soft sound his massive paws make on the moorstones. In Lancashire, he is Skriker, for the terrible shrieking cry that announces his presence. The Welsh know him as Cwnanwen, the hound of the otherworld, while in Scotland, he prowls the highlands as the Cwsith, his bark audible 3 counties away. But names are just sounds in the wind. What matters is what the black dog represents, the guardian at the threshold between the world of the living and whatever lies beyond. He appears at crossroads where ancient ways meet modern paths, on bridges that span rushing water, at the edges of graveyards where the dead sleep uneasily. Always, he stands watch at the places where one world bleeds into another. His size tells you everything you need to know about the magnitude of what he guards against. Some witnesses describe him as large as a calf, others as big as a small horse, but all agree that he dwarfs any earthly hound. His fur absorbs light like a hole torn in the fabric of reality, and his eyes burn with the accumulated weight of every soul he has escorted across the final threshold. For the black dog is Psychopomp, the guide who leads spirits from life to death, the ferryman who knows every path through the Shadowlands. Sometimes he appears as a herald, his howling cry serving as fair warning that death walks near. Sometimes he is guardian, protecting lone travelers from threats both mortal and supernatural. And sometimes, most terrifyingly, he is judge, determining whether a soul is ready for the journey that has no return. The encounters follow patterns as old as the hills themselves. A traveller walking alone on a dark road becomes aware of footsteps keeping pace, not quite in rhythm with his own, always slightly behind, accompanied by the soft panting of something large moving through the mist. When he turns to look, there is nothing visible, but the footsteps continue. Only when fear finally drives him to run does the black dog reveal himself, bounding alongside with ground-eating strides that make mockery of human speed, his burning eyes fixed not on the runner, but on something that follows behind, something the mortal cannot see, but which the dog knows intimately. When you see him sitting at your crossroads, when his eyes meet yours across the misty distance, remember this. The black dog has been waiting for you longer than you know. The question is not whether you will make the journey he guards. The question is whether you are ready to make it now. But perhaps the most terrifying guardian of all dwells, where the forest grows so thick the trees strangle the sky, where the very air tastes of secrets and old magic. Deep in the Russian wilderness, something moves between the pines that has no business existing in the waking world. The sound comes first, a grinding, scraping noise like bones rubbing against stone, accompanied by the rhythmic thud-thud-thud of massive chicken feet taking steps that shake the earth. Through the shadows comes a hut that walks like a living thing, balanced on two enormous chicken legs that end in talons capable of gutting a bear. The legs move with deliberate precision, lifting the strange dwelling high above the forest floor, carrying it wherever its mistress wills. Iron teeth ring the fence that surrounds this mobile dwelling. Not the teeth of animals, but the teeth of men, women, and children who thought they were clever enough to outwit what lives within. And what lives within is Baba Yaga herself, the iron-toothed witch who exists at the very edge of what can be understood or survived. She is ancient beyond measure, her wild hair white as fresh snow, her nose long and hooked like a scythe. When she grins, her iron teeth gleam with the luster of well-used blades, each one capable of grinding bones to powder or slicing through lies to reach the truth beneath. But Baba Yaga is not merely a monster, she is a test. She sits at the boundary between the human world and the realm of pure possibility, the place where the familiar ends and the truly dangerous begins. Those who seek her hut find that reaching her is only the first challenge. The hut spins constantly on its chicken legs, presenting no door, no entrance, no way inside for those who have not learned the proper words. Little hut, turn your back to the forest and your front to me, the seeker must call, and only then will the dwelling settle into stillness, its door facing forward like a mouth ready to swallow whatever approaches. Inside, Baba Yaga waits, and in that waiting lies her true power. She is the guardian of transformation, the keeper of the bridge between what is and what could be. Some who enter her hut emerge with magical gifts, rings that grant wishes, horses that fly, knowledge that makes them wealthy beyond imagining. Others become part of her fence, their teeth joining the iron barrier that protects her domain from the unworthy. The difference lies not in strength or cunning, but in something deeper, the willingness to face truth without flinching, to acknowledge the darkness within oneself, to accept that transformation always requires sacrifice. Baba Yaga sees through every pretense, every comfortable lie that people tell themselves. Her iron teeth can bite through flesh, but her iron gaze cuts deeper, penetrating to the core of a person's character. In the old stories, heroes approach her with requests. They need the firebird, the water of life, the power to defeat some terrible enemy. Baba Yaga listens with her head cocked like a bird of prey, her iron teeth gleaming in the light of her bone fire. Then she sets her price, not in gold or goods, but in service, in suffering, in the willingness to become something other than what they were. She sends them on quests that seem impossible, tasks that require them to shed their old selves like snakes shedding skin. Sort a mountain of mixed grain by morning, ride a horse made of wind to the castle of the dead, steal fire from the sun itself. These are not arbitrary challenges. They are surgical procedures of the soul, designed to cut away everything false and leave only what is essential. Those who succeed discover that Baba Yaga was never their enemy. She was their teacher, the harsh instructor who alone could prepare them for the trials that lay ahead. Those who fail learn that the world has no patience for those who seek power without wisdom, transformation without understanding. She represents the terrible truth that growth requires discomfort. that wisdom comes through suffering, that the most valuable gifts cannot be bought, but must be earned through ordeals that reveal the true content of a person's character. Her chicken-legged hut still moves through the forests of the mind, still carries her to places where the desperate and the ambitious gather. When you hear the grinding of bone on stone, when you smell the smoke of her bonfire drifting through the trees, remember this: Baba Yaga offers exactly what every visitor deserves, no more, no less. The question is not whether you can outwit her, but whether you are worthy of what you seek. And if you are not, her fence always has room for more teeth. In the lands where winter reigns for half the year and the sun becomes a stranger, these monsters take on characteristics that reflect the unique psychological pressures of life at the edge of survival. The cold does not merely chill the body, it freezes the soul, creating conditions where normal human warmth and connection become matters of life and death. When the sun disappears for months at a time, when the only light comes from fires that must be constantly fed and tended, the human mind begins to populate that darkness with shapes that explain why everything feels wrong, why hope dies a little more each day, why the very air seems to thicken with malevolent intent. The monsters of the north are teachers of harsh truths. They instruct through terror because gentle lessons do not survive the killing cold. The Krampus teaches children that society's rules are not suggestions, but requirements for survival. The Draugr warns that death is not an escape from responsibility, but a transformation that carries its own obligations. The mare reminds the sleeping that vulnerability has consequences, that even rest cannot be taken without proper precautions. The black dog shows that some boundaries should not be crossed without permission, that the spaces between worlds are guarded by powers older and wiser than human ambition. And Baba Yaga demonstrates that the most valuable transformations cannot be bought, but must be earned through ordeals that reveal the true content of a person's character. These creatures embody the shadow side of the collective unconscious, the aspects of human nature that emerge when comfort and safety disappear. They are what people become when pushed beyond their limits, when the father becomes the tyrant, when the protector becomes the predator, when the dreamer becomes the nightmare. But they also serve as pressure valves for communities under impossible strain. By projecting their fears onto supernatural threats, people create external enemies that can be fought, bargained with, or appeased. In the north, where survival depends on absolute cooperation and the willingness to sacrifice individual desires for community needs, monsters become the enforcers of social contract. They are what happens when someone breaks the rules that keep everyone alive. They are the consequences made manifest, the price of selfishness given form and teeth. The darkness breeds these creatures because darkness is honest in ways that daylight cannot match. In the cold and shadow of the northern winter, pretense dies. What remains is either strong enough to survive or becomes food for the things that prowl the edges of the firelight, patient as stone, hungry as the winter wind, waiting for their chance to teach the living what it means to fail the tests that matter most. When spring finally returns and the sun climbs higher in the sky, these monsters retreat to the spaces between seasons, the cracks in reality where winter never fully dies. But they do not disappear. They wait, as they have always waited, for the next time the darkness falls and the living need to remember why the old rules exist, why the ancient wisdom matters, why some fears should never be outgrown. For in the north, monsters are not the enemies of civilization. They are its guardians, the dark angels that ensure survival by making the alternatives too terrible to contemplate. The bells of the Orthodox Church ring out across the Wallachian countryside, their bronze voices carrying a different message than their Catholic cousins to the west. Here, in the borderlands between empires, where the living memory of plague still crawls through village streets like fog, death wears a face both familiar and terrible. The priest hurries down the muddy lane toward the cemetery, his black robes billowing behind him like raven wings, clutching the tools of his trade, holy water, wooden stakes, and the grim knowledge that sometimes the dead refuse to stay buried. This is Eastern Europe, where the earth itself seems reluctant to hold its secrets. Here, beneath the shadow of the Carpathian Mountains, where Ottoman armies once marched and the Black Death carved its name into every family tree, the boundary between life and death has worn thin as parchment. The soil, they say, tastes of old blood and older fears. It breeds creatures that exist in the spaces between heartbeats, in the pause between the last breath and whatever comes after. In these lands where empires collide and faith battles faith, where survival means knowing exactly when to cross yourself and when to drive a stake through a heart that should have stopped beating, monsters take on the weight of collective trauma. They carry the memory of sieges that lasted years, of plague carts that rattled through the night, of children who went to sleep healthy and woke up with their souls halfway to another realm. Here, death is not an ending but a transformation, and not all transformations lead to peace. The cemetery outside Kiselova huddles against the hillside like a collection of broken teeth, its weathered headstones marking graves that have been disturbed more times than the village priest cares to count. In the winter of 1725, the good people of this Serbian village learned that death was not always permanent, and that some sleepers dream violent dreams. Petar Blagojevic had been a simple peasant in life, unremarkable save for his temper and his tendency to hold grudges long past their expiration. But death had made him remarkable indeed, and now his neighbours gathered in the pale dawn light to dig up what they had buried only 8 weeks before. The body that emerged from the thawed earth bore little resemblance to the corpse they had lowered into the ground. Where decomposition should have claimed its due, they found instead a thing that looked almost alive, skin flushed with colour, hair and beard grown wild, fingernails long and sharp as talons. Fresh blood welled around the wooden stake as they drove it through the heart, spurting like a spring uncapped, accompanied by a groan that seemed to rise from the depths of the earth itself. This was strigoi, the Romanian word that encompasses both the living and the dead who walk in defiance of natural order. But Petar was merely one face of a phenomenon that stretches across the Slavic world like a plague of its own devising. In Serbia, they call them vampir. In Greece, vrikolakas. In Russia, upir. Different names for the same terrible truth, that some souls, wounded or wicked, refuse to accept the finality of the grave. The strigoi rises because the proper rituals have been forgotten or ignored, because death came at the wrong time or in the wrong way. Those who die by violence, by suicide, by the wasting diseases that turn the body against itself. These are the ones who return, driven by hungers that transcend the merely physical. They seek not just blood, but completion, the resolution of conflicts that death interrupted rather than resolved. But the vampire of Eastern European folklore bears little resemblance to the aristocratic seducers of later imagination. The strigoi is a peasant monster born from peasant fears. It returns to its own village, its own family, seeking the warmth and life it has lost. It appears first to its spouse, its children, its closest neighbours, not as a stranger stalking through the night, but as a familiar face made terrible by its refusal to accept extinction. The signs of its presence are intimate and domestic. Food disappears from tables. Animals sicken and die without apparent cause. Family members wake with unexplained marks on their throats, drained of vitality but unable to explain their weakness. The strigoi does not hunt. It feeds on what it believes still belongs to it, taking sustenance from those who should have mourned its passing, but must instead learn to fear its return. Protection against such creatures requires knowledge older than Christianity, but blessed by it nonetheless. Garlic hung above doorways, its pungent scent serving as a barrier the undead cannot cross. Running water, which the vampire cannot traverse. turning streams and rivers into moats around the living world. Most effective of all, the wooden stake driven through the heart, not from sadism, but from necessity. For only by pinning the corpse to the earth can the community ensure that death's sentence will finally be served. The fear of vampires reached its peak during the great plague cycles that swept through Eastern Europe like wildfire. In the 14th century, when the Black Death claimed 1/3 of Europe's population, and again in the 17th and 18th centuries, when smaller outbreaks continued to ravage isolated communities, the vampire became the explanation for why death seemed to spread from house to house, family to family, as if the dead were recruiting the living to join their terrible ranks. Medical ignorance made the vampire's existence seem not just possible, but inevitable. Bodies buried in shallow graves during plague times often showed signs of life weeks after interment, the gases of decomposition swelling the corpse, blood seeping from the mouth, hair and nails appearing to grow. To people who understood little of the body's chemistry after death, these seemed like proof that the corpse was not truly dead, but merely waiting for the right moment to rise and continue its predation. The vampire trials of the 18th century, documented in church records and government reports, reveal a systematic attempt to combat what entire communities believed to be a supernatural plague. Villagers would exhume bodies based on little more than suspicious deaths or unexplained illnesses among the survivors. Those corpses found in states of unnatural preservation were subjected to the full ritual of destruction, staking, decapitation, burning, their ashes scattered to prevent any possibility of return. But even as the vampire stalked the villages, other forms of the restless dead haunted the waters that carved the landscape. In the rivers and lakes of Eastern Europe, where drowning was common and the currents often carried bodies far from their homes, the Rusalka waited with the patience of the tide itself. Once, she had been a woman, young, beautiful, full of life and dreams of love. But love had betrayed her, or she had betrayed love, and the dark water had become her grave and her kingdom both. Now she dwells in the space between the riverbank and the deep water, her long hair flowing like weeds in the current, her pale skin gleaming like moonlight on wet stones. She is most dangerous during the week before Pentecost, when the boundary between worlds grows thin and the dead feel the pull of their former lives most strongly. Then she rises from her watery grave to dance in the moonlight, to sing with a voice like rushing water, to call to the men who pass by her domain. The Rusalka's song is the sound of water over stones, of wind through reeds, of every promise that was ever broken by the riverbank. She offers love to the lonely, comfort to the grieving, companionship to those who walk alone through the night. But her embrace is cold as winter rain, and those who follow her into the water find that her love is the love of the grave, complete, eternal, and utterly consuming. Some say she seeks revenge against the man who wronged her, luring him to share her watery fate. Others claim she hungers for the warmth of living flesh, for the beating heart that she no longer possesses. But perhaps the truth is simpler and more terrible. The Rusalka represents the danger of a love itself, the way passion can drown reason, the way desire can pull the unwary beneath the surface of safety into depths from which there is no return. Protection against the Rusalka requires understanding her nature as a creature of boundaries and thresholds. She cannot venture far from her water, cannot enter homes uninvited, cannot touch those who carry the proper charms. Wormwood scattered around the house keeps her at bay, its bitter scent reminding her of the tears she shed in life. Circles drawn in the dirt create barriers she cannot cross. Most powerful of all, the love of family and the bonds of community, for the Rusalka preys on the isolated, the abandoned, those who have forgotten that they belong to the world of the living. But while the Rusalka haunts the waters and the Strigoi stalks the graveyards, other creatures emerge from the peculiar spiritual tensions of Eastern European Christianity. The Vrikolakas of Greek folklore embodies the fear of religious exclusion, the terror of dying outside the grace of the church. This monster rises not from violent death or unfulfilled desire, but from the simple fact of excommunication, the formal severing of the soul from the body of Christian community. The Orthodox Church, with its emphasis on proper burial rites and the eternal fate of the soul, created the conditions for the Vrikolakas to flourish. Those who died while excommunicated, who had been denied the sacraments in life or proper burial in death, became trapped in a liminal state, too cursed for heaven, too animate for the grave. They wandered the earth in a state of spiritual starvation, seeking the communion they had been denied in life. Unlike the familiar vampire who feeds on blood, the Vrikolakas sustains itself on the fear and faith of the living. It appears first as a restless spirit, knocking on doors, calling out the names of family members, begging to be let in from the cold of spiritual exile. But those who show it pity, who open their doors to what appears to be a lost soul seeking shelter, discover too late that some forms of exclusion exist for good reason. The Vrikolakas teaches that spiritual community comes with responsibilities as well as benefits. To be part of the church means accepting its authority, following its rules, participating in its rituals. Those who reject this communion, whether through heresy, sin, or simple rebellion, risk finding themselves cut off not just from the community of the living, but from the possibility of peaceful death. Even the household spirits of Slavic tradition carry the weight of Eastern European anxieties about family, property, and the proper order of domestic life. The domovoi, unlike the monsters that stalk graveyards and riverbanks, represents the protective power of tradition when properly honored. This small, bearded creature dwells behind the stove or beneath the threshold, guardian of the family line and keeper of the household's luck. But the domovoi's protection comes with a price. He demands proper behavior from the family he serves, cleanliness, respect for the ancestors, adherence to the old ways of doing things. A household that neglects its traditions, that abandons the rituals that bind family to land and living to dead, will find that their domovoi has become something else entirely, a dvorovoi, a creature of mischief and malice that sours milk, sickens livestock, and brings misfortune to all who dwell under the roof he once protected. The domovoi reveals the double edge of tradition in societies where change means danger, where innovation can lead to disaster, where survival depends on following patterns established by generations of the dead. He is both comfort and chain, protector and prison guard, ensuring that the living remember their place in the long chain of being that stretches from the first human to the last. In these lands where empires have risen and fallen like wheat before the scythe, where armies have marched back and forth across the same bloody ground for centuries, where plague and war and famine have become as regular as the seasons, the undead serve a function more complex than simple terror. They are the memory keepers, the guardians of trauma, the living proof that some wounds never heal and some wrongs never rest. The vampire reminds the community that death is not escape from consequence, that the sins of the past will return to feed on the blood of the present. The Rusalka warns that love without wisdom leads to destruction, that passion unchecked by reason drowns both lover and beloved. The Vrikolakas teaches that spiritual community cannot be taken for granted, that exclusion from the sacred carries costs that extend beyond the grave. And the domovoi demonstrates that tradition serves as both shelter and shackle, protecting those who honor it while punishing those who abandon its demands. These monsters rise from soil that has been watered with tears and blood for 1,000 years. They emerge from the collective unconscious of people who have learned that safety is temporary, that order is fragile, that the price of survival is eternal vigilance against forces both seen and unseen. In Eastern Europe, the undead are not visitors from some distant realm of horror. They are neighbors, family members, the familiar faces of the community's own fears made manifest. They teach that death is not an ending, but a transition, that the grave is not a wall, but a doorway, that the boundary between the living and the dead is marked not by stone markers, but by the rituals and remembrances that keep each in their proper place. When those rituals fail, when the remembrance falters, when the living forget their obligations to the dead, then the monsters rise to remind them that some debts can never be fully paid, some hungers can never be satisfied, and some sleepers should never be allowed to wake. The earth of Eastern Europe still holds its secrets poorly. In village graveyards where the soil shifts in the night, in rivers where the current carries more than water, in houses where the shadows move when no one is watching, the undead continue their ancient work. They serve as reminders that in a world where death comes suddenly and often, where the difference between the living and the dead can be measured in heartbeats, the only safety lies in remembering that some boundaries should never be crossed, some doors should never be opened, and some graves should never be disturbed. For in these lands where winter lasts half the year and memory lasts forever, the monsters are not intruders from another world. They are the guardians of this one, ensuring that the living never forget the price of peace, the cost of safety, and the terrible responsibility that comes with drawing breath in a world where the dead outnumber the living and some of them refuse to rest. The morning mist hangs heavy over the German forest, clinging to the oak trees like the breath of sleeping giants. Somewhere in the distance, church bells ring the call to morning prayer, but their bronze voices seem strangely muffled, as if the very air resists the sound of sanctity. In the village of Bedburg, the year is 1589, and the woodcutters who venture into the green twilight beneath the ancient canopy walk with silver, blessed by priests and prayers, mumbled through clenched teeth. They have learned to read the signs, the unnaturally quiet birds, the tracks that begin as a man's boot and end as something altogether different. The sheep found torn apart with a precision that speaks of intelligence behind the savagery. This is Central Europe, the fractured heart of the continent, where the Holy Roman Empire sprawls across a patchwork of duchies and principalities, like a tapestry coming apart at the seams. Here, between the Rhine and the Danube, where the 30 Years' War will soon turn brother against brother and reduce entire cities to ash and memory, the very ground seems to shift beneath the feet of those who dare call it home. The forests that once sheltered hermits and saints now hide creatures that wear familiar faces, and the most dangerous monsters are those that were once entirely human. In these lands, where identity itself has become a luxury that few can afford, where a man might wake up speaking German and go to sleep under a different flag entirely, transformation is not a supernatural curse, but a survival skill. The monsters that emerge from this fractured landscape reflect a deeper truth, that under enough pressure, anything can break. And when humanity breaks, what emerges from the cracks is something that remembers being human, but has forgotten why that mattered. Peter Stubber stands in the courthouse in Cologne, his arms missing below the elbows, his body broken by the wheel and the rack, but his eyes still holding the terrible clarity of a man who has seen himself for what he truly is. For 25 years he has terrorized the countryside around Bedburg, and now the authorities have finally caught their wolf. But as they list his crimes, the children devoured, the pregnant women torn open, the acts of cannibalism that defy description, the crowd begins to understand that the monster they have captured is something far worse than a simple beast. Stubber had been a farmer once, a man with a wife and children, someone who knelt in church on Sundays and paid his taxes when the tax collectors came calling. But the wolf belt had changed all that, the enchanted girdle that allowed him to take the shape of a great grey wolf, to run on 4 legs through the moonlit forest, to hunt with teeth and claws instead of conscience and restraint. For a quarter century, he had lived 2 lives. By day, the quiet farmer who nodded to his neighbors and tended his fields. By night, the ravening beast that stalked those same neighbors and fed on their children. But the wolf belt was only part of the story. What made Peter Stubber truly monstrous was not his ability to change shape, but his refusal to change souls. Even in wolf form, he retained his human intelligence, his capacity for planning and cruelty that no mere animal could match. He did not kill for hunger alone, but for the pleasure of it, the intoxicating freedom of existing without moral constraint. The wolf gave him the excuse, but the choice to embrace monstrosity had always been his own. The werewolf, or werewolf in the old Germanic tongues, represents the fear that civilization is nothing more than a thin veneer painted over an animal nature that never truly disappears. In the courts of Central Europe, where the records of lycanthropy trials stretch back centuries, the werewolf emerges not as a supernatural curse, but as a psychological condition, the complete abandonment of human society in favor of bestial freedom. But Stubber's transformation was voluntary, chosen rather than inflicted. Other forms of lycanthropy speak to darker truths about the nature of identity itself. In the alpine villages, where the very mountains seem to press down on human ambition, where the valleys trap sound and shadow in equal measure, people speak in whispers of the Bergsgeist, the mountain spirits that can steal a man's shape as easily as his shadow, leaving behind only an empty shell that wanders the high passes, searching for the self it has lost. These shapeshifters embody the anxiety of a fractured continent where political boundaries shift like sand and personal identity becomes a luxury that must be constantly defended. When a man can wake up as a citizen of one prince and go to sleep as the subject of another, when the language spoken in the marketplace changes with the latest conquest, when the very ground beneath one's feet might belong to a different lord by nightfall, the question of who one truly is becomes a matter of existential terror. And in the bedchambers of Central Europe, where the night brings not rest, but renewed torment, another kind of shapeshifter stalks the dreams of the innocent. The Alp slips through keyholes like smoke, settles on sleeping chests like a stone, and rides the dreams of its victims like a horse galloping toward madness. But unlike the mare of the northern countries, the Alp is specifically male, a demon of masculine anxiety and sexual frustration that preys on both men and women with equal appetite. The word itself comes from the same root as elf, but the Alp has none of the ethereal beauty of fairy folk. Instead, it appears as a small, misshapen man with the features of a nightmare, skin like dirty parchment, eyes that glow with unholy fire, a mouth that stretches too wide for its face. It wears a hat that renders it invisible to all but its chosen victim, and its touch brings not just paralysis, but violation, the sense of being invaded by something that should never have been allowed so close to human vulnerability. The Alp feeds on the sexual energy of the sleeping, but its hunger goes deeper than mere physical desire. It seeks to corrupt the very dreams that allow the mind to process the day's anxieties and fears, turning the sanctuary of sleep into a battleground where shame and desire war against each other until the victim wakes exhausted, violated, carrying the memory of pleasures that fill them with disgust and terror in equal measure. But the Alp's true horror lies not in its actions, but in its origins. Folk wisdom holds that the Alp is born from the souls of children who die unbaptized, or from men who live lives of such sexual frustration that their desires literally take on a life of their own after death. It represents the fear that repression creates its own monsters, that denying the shadow side of human nature only gives it power to manifest in forms more terrible than anything honest acknowledgement could produce. In a society where sexual behavior is rigidly controlled by both church and state, where deviation from prescribed norms brings not just social condemnation, but legal punishment, the Alp serves as both warning and release valve. It embodies the return of the repressed, the way denied desires find expression through supernatural channels that allow the community to acknowledge their existence while maintaining the fiction that such things come from outside rather than within. And yet, even as the Alp torments the sleeping, another kind of doubling haunts the waking world of Central Europe. In the cities where merchants and craftsmen jostle for position in an economy that changes as rapidly as the political landscape, where success depends on knowing exactly who to trust and who to fear, the doppelganger stalks the shadows with the face of everyone and the loyalty of no one. The German word means double walker, and it captures perfectly the terror of encountering oneself as stranger and enemy. The doppelganger appears as an exact duplicate of its victim. Same face, same voice, same mannerisms, but lacking the soul that makes identity more than mere appearance. It seeks to replace the original, to steal not just their place in the world, but their very existence, leaving behind only memories and the growing suspicion that something essential has been lost. But the doppelganger is more than a supernatural imposter. It is the projection of internal division, the externalized fear that the self is not unified, but fragmented, that identity is not fixed but fluid, that the person one shows to the world might be nothing more than a mask covering a void. In an age where survival often depends on the ability to present different faces to different authorities, where loyalty must be performed rather than felt, where the wrong word to the wrong person can mean exile or death, the fear of losing oneself becomes literally monstrous. The doppelganger appears most often to those who have compromised their principles for survival, who have bent their personalities to fit the demands of changing times until they no longer remember what they originally stood for. It is the face in the mirror that no longer quite matches the face that greets the morning, the voice that speaks words its owner does not remember choosing, the hand that signs documents in a signature that looks familiar but feels foreign. Some say the doppelganger can be defeated by confronting it directly, by refusing to be intimidated by the sight of one's own face, wearing an expression of malevolent intent. Others claim that it can only be banished by rediscovering authentic identity, by choosing to be something specific rather than adapting endlessly to external pressures. But perhaps the truth is simpler and more terrible. The doppelganger cannot be defeated because it is not really separate from its victim. It is the part of the self that has been abandoned in the name of survival, and it will continue to appear until the original becomes willing to reclaim it. While the doppelganger stalks the cities and the Alp haunts the bedchambers, another creature emerges from the plague pits and charnel houses where death has become an industry rather than a tragedy. The Nachera, the after-devourer, rises from graves where the dead have been buried too quickly, without proper preparation, in soil that has been poisoned by too much death too quickly absorbed. Unlike the aristocratic vampires of later imagination, the Nachera is a creature of scarcity and desperation. It emerges during times of plague and famine, when the living barely have enough resources to care for themselves, let alone properly tend to the dead. Its very appearance speaks to the degradation that comes when death becomes commonplace. Wrapped in its burial shroud like a winding sheet, its face partially mummified, its teeth grown long and yellow from gnawing on its own burial clothes. The Nachera does not seduce its victims or stalk them through moonlit nights. Instead, it feeds on the living through supernatural sympathy, draining the life force of family members while remaining safely buried in its grave. Those related to the Nachera by blood or marriage begin to waste away without apparent cause, growing weaker and paler as the creature feeds on their vitality from a distance. The only way to break this connection is to exhume the body and stuff its mouth with stones or bricks, preventing it from continuing its subterranean feast. This monster embodies the very real horror of epidemic disease, the way death seems to follow family lines and spread through communities as if guided by malevolent intelligence. In an age before germ theory, when the mechanisms of contagion remained mysterious, The Nachera provided an explanation for why some families seemed cursed with consecutive deaths, while others remained relatively untouched. But the Nachera also represents the fear of being forgotten, of dying without proper ceremony or remembrance. It rises from graves where love was insufficient to provide proper burial, where economic necessity forced the living to choose between feeding themselves and honoring their dead. It punishes not wickedness, but poverty, not sin, but the simple inability to afford the rituals that keep the dead in their proper place. In the Central European tradition, the Nachera teaches that death, like life, requires resources, time, attention, money, and most importantly, memory. When the living are too overwhelmed by their own survival to properly tend to the dead, when economic pressure forces them to cut corners on funeral rites and burial customs, the dead find their own ways to demand what they are owed. These creatures of transformation and doubling reflect the unique pressures of life in the heart of Europe during its most chaotic periods. They emerge from a landscape where identity itself has become unstable, where the social contracts that once provided security have been shattered by war and political upheaval, where survival often depends on the willingness to become something other than what one was born to be. The werewolf shows that the choice to abandon humanity is always individual, that no external force can make a person monstrous without their cooperation. The Alp reveals that repression creates its own demons, that denied desires find expression in forms more terrible than honest acknowledgement could ever produce. The doppelganger embodies the fear that adaptation can go too far, that flexibility can become formlessness, that the self can be bent until it breaks entirely. And the Nachera warns that even death requires proper attention, that the neglect of ritual obligations to the dead will inevitably result in supernatural consequences for the living. Together, these monsters map the psychological terrain of a continent in crisis, where the old certainties have crumbled but new ones have yet to emerge. They show that the most dangerous transformations are not those imposed by supernatural forces, but those chosen by human beings who have decided that survival justifies any compromise, any adaptation, any abandonment of the principles that once defined them. In Central Europe, where the very ground shifts beneath the feet of those who call it home, where borders move like living things and identity becomes a matter of daily negotiation, these monsters serve as warnings about the price of infinite flexibility. They teach that some things should remain constant even when everything else changes, that the core of human identity must be protected even when its expression must adapt to new circumstances. The forests of Central Europe still whisper with the memory of these transformations. In the shadows between the ancient oaks, where the sunlight filters down through leaves that have witnessed centuries of human struggle, the question remains, what happens when the pressure to change becomes so great that change itself becomes the only constant? The monsters know the answer, and they wait patiently for the next generation to discover it for themselves. For in these lands where survival has always required the willingness to become something new, the greatest horror is not the fear of transformation. It is the possibility that transformation might never end, that change might continue until nothing recognizable remains, that adaptation might proceed until the very concept of authentic selfhood becomes as obsolete as the empires that once claimed dominion over these restless, shape-shifting lands. The cathedral bells of Chartres ring out across the French countryside, their bronze voices proclaiming the triumph of Christian order over the chaos of the pagan past. But beneath their sacred harmonies, older songs still whisper through the ancient stones, melodies that predate the cross, that remember when the forests were temples and the standing stones were altars to gods whose names the church has tried to forget. In the shadows of these great cathedrals, where the light filters through glass windows depicting saints and martyrs, other figures move with the fluid grace of creatures who belong to neither heaven nor hell, but to the wild spaces between human understanding and divine mystery. This is Western Europe, where the Roman roads still snake across landscapes that have known conquest and reconquest since Caesar's legions first marched north from the Mediterranean. Here, in the green valleys of Ireland and the misty moors of Scotland, in the wine country of France and the merchant cities of the Low Countries, civilization has achieved a sophistication unknown in the harsher lands to the east and north. But sophistication brings its own shadows, and the monsters that emerge from this cultured landscape reflect not the crude fears of survival, but the more subtle terrors of desire, temptation, and the price of knowledge. In these lands where courtly love has become an art form, and chivalric romance shapes the dreams of nobles and commoners alike, where the very concept of individual desire has been elevated to a virtue worth celebrating, the monsters take on forms that speak to the complexities of human longing. They are seducers and teachers, tempters and guardians, creatures that offer what the heart desires while demanding prices that the soul may not be willing to pay. The scriptorium of the monastery at Cluny falls silent as Brother Thomas lays down his quill, his hand trembling not from age but from the memory of what visited him in the darkness before dawn. The illuminated manuscript he's been copying, the Malleus Maleficarum, that great catalogue of demonic behaviour, lies open before him, its pages filled with meticulous descriptions of creatures that should exist only in the fevered imagination of theologians. But Thomas knows better now. He has felt the weight of something settling onto his chest in the pre-dawn hours, has experienced the crushing pressure that steals breath and reason alike, has awakened to find evidence of visitation that his rational mind cannot explain away. She came to him as a woman of impossible beauty, her skin pale as candle wax, her hair flowing like black water down shoulders that seemed to glow with their own inner light. Her eyes held depths that promised secrets older than scripture, and when she smiled, Thomas saw eternity reflected in her teeth. She called herself by no name, for names have power and she needed none. She was Succubus, the one who lies beneath, the demon who feeds on the desires that holy men spend their lives trying to suppress. But the Succubus is more than a simple tempter of monks and priests. She is the Church's answer to the problem of male desire, in an institution that demands celibacy, the supernatural explanation for nocturnal emissions and erotic dreams that threaten to undermine the spiritual authority of those who have sworn to renounce the flesh. In her presence, the most devout man becomes an animal, and the most rational mind dissolves into primitive hunger. The Church Fathers understood her danger perfectly. Unlike other demons who attack the soul directly, the succubus works through the body, using its own appetites against it. She appears during the vulnerable hours of sleep, when the conscious mind relaxes its vigilance and the body's needs assert themselves without shame or restraint. Her beauty is not random, but precisely calibrated to each victim's particular desires. She becomes whatever the beholder most wants to possess, then uses that desire to possess him in return. Her male counterpart, the incubus, serves a different but equally crucial function in the Church's understanding of female sexuality. Where the succubus explains away the embarrassing evidence of male arousal, the incubus provides a supernatural excuse for female pleasure, particularly the pleasure that might lead to pregnancy outside the bounds of marriage. A woman visited by an incubus cannot be held responsible for her condition. She has been the victim of supernatural rape, her body used without her consent by a demon whose appetites transcend human understanding. But beneath the theological explanations lies a deeper truth about the nature of desire itself. The succubus and incubus represent the fear that sexual appetite is inherently destructive, that it reduces human beings to their most animal impulses and opens them to influences that exist beyond moral control. They embody the Church's teaching that the flesh is the enemy of the spirit, that physical pleasure invariably leads to spiritual corruption, that the only safe course is absolute denial of bodily desires. Yet even as the Church seeks to codify the supernatural threats to human purity, older powers stir in the forests and fields, where peasants still leave offerings at stones that predate Christianity by millennia. The fairies of Celtic tradition exist in a realm parallel to, but separate from both Christian heaven and hell, a twilight kingdom where morality operates by rules that have nothing to do with sin and salvation, and everything to do with the deeper rhythms of nature itself. They are the seelie and unseelie courts, the blessed and unblessed Fae, beings of such beauty and terrible power that mortals who glimpse them are forever changed by the experience. But their beauty is not human beauty, and their morality is not human morality. They operate according to laws older than civilization, codes of behavior that seem arbitrary to human understanding, but which reflect the fundamental principles by which the natural world operates: reciprocity, balance, and the inexorable cycle of growth, death, and renewal. The fairies appear to humans as creatures of impossible loveliness, their skin luminous as pearl, their movements graceful as flowing water, their voices carrying melodies that make the finest human music sound like the scraping of rusty iron. But their beauty is predatory, designed to lure mortals away from the safe boundaries of human community, into realms where time moves differently, and the very concept of returning home becomes meaningless. A man who follows the fairy procession into the depths of the forest may experience what seems like a single night of revelry and pleasure, only to emerge and discover that decades have passed in the mortal world, that his wife has remarried and his children have grown old and died. A woman who accepts the invitation to dance with the fairy king may find herself trapped in an eternal waltz, her feet bleeding from steps that never end, her mind slowly fragmenting under the weight of pleasure that has become indistinguishable from torture. But the fairies are not simply malevolent. They represent a form of morality that predates human civilization, a set of values that prioritizes the wild and free over the safe and predictable. They punish those who show disrespect for the natural world, who take without giving, who forget that human beings are part of a larger web of existence that includes beings far older and more powerful than themselves. In the Celtic tradition, the fairies serve as guardians of the boundary between the civilized and the wild, between the world of human law and the realm of natural law. They remind mortals that there are powers in the world that do not answer to king or pope, forces that operate according to principles that human understanding cannot fully grasp. They are the return of the repressed pagan world, the reassertion of values that Christianity has tried to erase, but which continue to exist in the spaces between official doctrine and folk wisdom. And yet, even as the noble courts celebrate the beauty of fairy tales and the magic of courtly romance, a darker understanding of female power stalks the margins of Western European society. In the cottage at the edge of the village, where the herbs grow wild and the old woman's eyes hold knowledge that makes young wives nervous and old husbands afraid, wisdom wears the face of the hag. She is the crone who remembers the old ways, who knows which plants heal and which ones kill, who can read the future in the flight of birds and the patterns of smoke from her fire. But the hag is more than a wise woman. She is the embodiment of female knowledge that exists outside the control of patriarchal authority. In her presence, men become children again, dependent on her wisdom for their survival. She knows the secrets of birth and death, of healing and harming, of the thin places where the world of spirit bleeds through into the world of flesh. Her knowledge is practical rather than theoretical, earned through decades of experience rather than years of study. The Church, threatened by this alternative source of authority, transforms the wise woman into the witch, the healer into the poisoner, the midwife into the child killer. The Malleus Maleficarum devotes hundreds of pages to cataloguing the supposed crimes of such women, creating a systematic theology of female evil that justifies the most extreme measures against those who dare to practice the old arts. But beneath the persecution lies a more fundamental fear, the terror that women might possess forms of power that do not require male validation or approval. The hag represents the autonomous feminine, the aspect of womanhood that cannot be controlled through marriage or motherhood. She is the maiden grown old without losing her independence, the mother who has raised her children and reclaimed her own life, the woman who has learned to draw power from sources that have nothing to do with male desire or approval. Her wisdom comes with a price, for she has seen too much to retain the comfortable illusions that allow most people to function in daily life. She knows that love is temporary, that beauty fades, that death comes for everyone regardless of their virtue or wickedness. But she also knows the deeper truths that lie beneath these surface disappointments, that wisdom can be more valuable than beauty, that solitude can be more satisfying than companionship, that the power to heal can be worth the isolation that comes with knowledge. And in the wild spaces where the hag gathers her herbs and the fairies hold their courts, another force moves with the sound of thunder and the flash of lightning across storm-darkened skies. The wild hunt rides through the night skies of Western Europe, a spectral procession led by figures whose names change from region to region, but whose essence remains constant. They are the leaders of the unquiet dead, the commanders of souls who died with business unfinished and desires unfulfilled. In England, the wild hunt is led by Herne the Hunter, the antlered god who rules the deepest forests and the darkest nights. In Wales, it follows Gwyn ap Nudd, the lord of the otherworld who rides a pale horse through moonlit valleys. In France, King Arthur himself leads the ghostly cavalcade, his quest for the Grail transformed into an eternal chase across the borderlands between life and death. But regardless of who leads them, the huntsmen share common characteristics that reveal their true nature. They appear during times of social upheaval, when the normal order of things has been disrupted and the boundaries between the living and the dead have worn thin. They serve as harbingers of change, announcing through their wild passage that the old world is ending and a new one is about to be born. The wild hunt represents the return of repressed chaos, the reassertion of primal forces that civilization has tried to tame, but never quite succeeded in destroying. They ride across the sky like a reminder that order is temporary, that the careful structures humans build to contain and direct natural forces are ultimately fragile, that beneath the surface of every civilized society lies the potential for wildness to reassert itself. Those who witness the wild hunt are forever changed by the experience. Some are driven mad by the sight of so much supernatural power unleashed. Others are inspired to abandon their mundane lives and seek adventure in the wild places where normal rules do not apply. A few are taken by the hunt itself, joining the eternal cavalcade of souls who have chosen the wild freedom of the chase over the safe constraints of mortal existence. In Ireland, where the mists roll in from the Atlantic, and the ancient stones still remember the names of gods whose worship predates written history, another figure emerges from the intersection of death and prophecy. The Banshee appears as a woman whose beauty has been transformed by grief into something that transcends human categories of attractiveness or ugliness. Her long hair streams behind her like silver water, and her voice carries the accumulated sorrow of every mother who has ever lost a child, every wife who has ever buried a husband, every daughter who has ever stood beside a father's grave. But the Banshee is not simply a herald of death. She is the personification of the connection between the living and the dead, the embodiment of the love that survives even the ultimate separation. She appears only to families of ancient lineage, to bloodlines that stretch back into the mist-shrouded past, when the boundary between the mortal world and the other world was more porous than it has since become. Her keen, the wailing cry that announces death's approach, is both warning and lament. It tells the living that their time with a loved one is ending, but it also affirms that love itself is stronger than death, that the bonds forged in life continue to operate even after the grave has claimed its due. The Banshee weeps for the dead, not because death is evil, but because separation is painful, not because ending is wrong, but because love makes every ending a tragedy. In her presence, the living confront the fundamental truth that love and loss are inseparable, that the capacity to care deeply about another person inevitably leads to the experience of grief. She represents the price of emotional attachment in a world where nothing lasts forever, the cost of allowing oneself to love in the face of certain loss. These creatures of desire and wisdom, of temptation and prophecy, reflect the unique psychological landscape of Western Europe during its flowering as the center of medieval civilization. They emerge from a culture sophisticated enough to celebrate individual desire while remaining aware of its dangers, wise enough to value knowledge while recognizing that wisdom comes with its own forms of isolation. The succubus and incubus embody the Church's struggle to reconcile spiritual aspiration with bodily reality, the ongoing tension between the ideal of perfect purity and the undeniable facts of human desire. The fairies represent the persistence of older values in the face of Christian transformation, the reassertion of natural law against the artificial constructions of human morality. The hag shows that wisdom and power can exist outside the officially sanctioned channels of authority, that knowledge gained through experience can be more valuable than learning acquired through study. The wild hunt reminds the civilized world that chaos is never far away, that the forces of wildness and change are always ready to reassert themselves against the structures of order and control. And the Banshee teaches that love makes every loss meaningful, that the capacity to grieve is inseparable from the capacity to care. Together, these monsters map the emotional terrain of a civilization that has achieved enough security to indulge in luxury, but remains aware that luxury comes with its own dangers. They show that sophistication brings its own forms of vulnerability, that the more complex human desires become, the more complex the threats to human well-being. In Western Europe, where the cathedrals reach toward heaven, but the old stone circles still draw pilgrims in the moonlight, where courtly love coexists with monastic celibacy, where the newest learning builds upon the oldest wisdom, monsters serve not as simple threats, but as teachers of nuanced truths. They reveal that desire is neither purely good nor purely evil, but a force that requires understanding and respect. They show that knowledge brings both power and responsibility, that wisdom earned through experience is different from knowledge acquired through study, that the attempt to suppress natural forces often leads to their manifestation in more dangerous forms. The mists still roll across the Irish countryside, and in those mists, shapes still move that speak to truths older than the stones of the oldest churches. The forests of France still whisper with voices that remember when the druids walked beneath their branches, when the old gods accepted sacrifices at altars that have since been consecrated to saints, whose names the forest spirits have never learned to pronounce. For in Western Europe, where civilization has learned to celebrate beauty while remaining aware of its dangers, where desire has been elevated to an art form while retaining its connection to destruction, the monsters serve as reminders that some truths cannot be tamed, that some forces cannot be civilized, that some aspects of human experience will always remain wild, dangerous, and utterly necessary for the continuation of life itself. The Mediterranean sun bleaches the marble columns of the Parthenon, but in their shadows, older shadows still move with the fluid grace of creatures who remember when these stones were temples rather than ruins. The olive groves that carpet the hillsides whisper with voices that predate Homer, that sang of gods and monsters when the world was young and the line between the divine and the demonic had not yet been drawn by theologians who would not be born for centuries. Here, in the cradle of Western civilization, where philosophy first dared to question the nature of existence and democracy, first promised that mortals might govern themselves, the monsters carry the weight of deep time, the accumulated memory of every empire that has risen and fallen beneath these ancient skies. This is southern Europe, where the ruins of Rome still dominate the landscape like the bones of giants, where the Byzantine Empire once stretched its golden arms across 3 continents, where the Renaissance was born from the marriage of Christian faith and pagan learning. In these lands where marble speaks of vanished glory and every stone holds the echo of conquests that reshape the world, the monsters emerge not from the wild forests or the mysterious north, but from the collision between old wisdom and new faith, between the gods who once ruled from mountaintops and the God who now reigns from heaven. The creatures that stalk these sun-drenched landscapes carry in their forms the tension between classical mythology and Christian theology, between the sophisticated understanding of human nature developed by ancient philosophers and the moral absolutes demanded by medieval faith. They are beings born from the fragments of shattered pantheons, from the spaces between what was and what has become, from the terrible knowledge that even the mightiest civilizations are temporary, and that gods themselves can die. In the mountains of Arcadia, where the shepherd boys still tell stories their grandfathers heard from their grandfathers, where the old songs echo through valleys that have witnessed the rise and fall of more empires than human memory can contain, something moves through the olive groves with steps that make no sound on the ancient stones. She appears first as a woman of impossible beauty, her dark hair flowing like water down shoulders that gleam like polished bronze in the dappled sunlight. But those who look too closely see that her legs end not in feet, but in the coiled length of a serpent, and her eyes hold depths that speak of hungers older than civilization. This is Lameia, whose name has become a whisper that mothers use to frighten children into obedience, but whose origins stretch back to the very dawn of human storytelling. Once, she was beloved of Zeus himself, queen of Libya and mother to beautiful children who filled her palace with laughter and light. But Hera's jealousy knows no bounds, and the goddess's curse fell upon Lameia like a plague, transforming love into loss, beauty into horror, maternal care into child-devouring hunger. The curse stripped everything from Lameia except her beauty and her rage. Her children died, one by one, victims of Hera's jealousy, until the palace that had once echoed with their voices became a tomb that echoed only with her screams. But death was not the end of her torment. It was only the beginning. The gods cursed her to live with her loss, to remember every moment of happiness that had been stolen from her, to feel the weight of her children's absence like a physical pain that would never fade. But the cruelest part of the curse was the hunger it awakened within her. Denied her own children, Lameia began to crave the children of others, to see in every infant's face the echo of what she had lost. She became the child snatcher, the nursery demon, the thing that mothers fear will slip through windows in the night to steal away their sleeping babies. Her serpentine lower body allows her to move through the smallest spaces, to coil around the beds of children and carry them away to places where their cries will never be heard. But Lameia is more than a simple monster. She is the embodiment of grief transformed into rage, of love corrupted by loss, until it becomes indistinguishable from hatred. She represents the fear that maternal instinct can become predatory, that the drive to nurture can be inverted into the compulsion to destroy. In her story, the classical world grappled with the terrible understanding that the forces that create life are the same forces that can destroy it, that the capacity for great love inevitably includes the capacity for great violence. The philosophers of ancient Greece understood that Lameia represented a fundamental truth about human nature, that suffering, when it becomes too great to bear, can transform the sufferer into the very thing they once feared. She is not evil by choice but by circumstance, not monstrous by nature but by necessity. Her story serves as a warning about the price of divine favor. the danger of attracting the attention of powers greater than mortal understanding. And in the tavernas of modern Greece, where the wine flows like liquid amber and the tourists come to see the ruins of ancient glory, old men still lower their voices when they speak of the Lameia, still warn their grandchildren that some hungers can never be satisfied, that some losses can never be accepted, that the line between victim and predator is thinner than most people dare to believe. But while Lameia stalks the mountains of Arcadia, other creatures emerge from the philosophical schools of Athens, where the pursuit of knowledge has opened doors that perhaps should have remained closed. In the academy where Plato once taught that reality was but a shadow cast by higher truths, where students learn to question the nature of existence itself, something moves between the columns with the measured pace of a teacher, but the predatory grace of a hunter. Empusa appears as a woman of stunning beauty, her bronze leg gleaming in the sunlight that filters through the olive branches, her other foot cloven like that of a beast. She is the shapeshifter par excellence, the master of illusion who can appear as whatever her victim most desires. But her beauty is not random, it is precisely calculated, designed to reveal the hidden weaknesses of those who encounter her, to expose the desires they would rather keep secret, even from themselves. In the teachings of the philosophers, Empusa represents the danger of intellectual pride, the way the pursuit of knowledge can become corrupted by the desire for power over others. She preys specifically on students and scholars, appearing to them as the perfect teacher, who promises to reveal the ultimate secrets of existence. But those who follow her deeper into the groves of academe discover that her lessons lead not to enlightenment but to madness, not to truth but to the kind of knowledge that destroys rather than illuminates. Empusa embodies the classical understanding that knowledge, like fire, is a tool that can either warm the hearth or burn down the house. She represents the temptation to seek learning for its own sake, rather than for the wisdom it might bring, to accumulate facts and theories without developing the judgment to use them properly. Her bronze leg speaks to the mechanistic nature of pure intellectualism, while her beast's hoof reveals the animal appetites that drive even the most refined scholarly pursuits. But perhaps most terrifyingly, Empusa demonstrates that the line between teacher and predator is often thinner than students would like to believe. She appears as the mentor who promises to unlock hidden potential, the guide who offers to lead seekers to heights of understanding they could never reach alone. But her true nature is revealed in the price she demands, not gold or goods, but the very capacity for independent thought, the surrender of critical judgment in favor of blind acceptance of her authority. While the philosophers debated the nature of reality in their marble halls, darker shapes took flight from the crags and cliffs where the old gods once made their homes. The Strix, the screech owl transformed into a blood-drinking demon, emerges from the borderlands between the rational and the primitive, between the enlightened world of classical learning and the ancient fears that no amount of philosophy can entirely banish. Unlike the vampires of Eastern European folklore, the Strix is a creature of the air, capable of transforming from woman to bird and back again with the fluid ease of thought itself. In owl form, she possesses all the natural advantages of her species: silent flight, perfect night vision, the ability to turn her head completely around to see threats approaching from any direction. But when she resumes human form, she retains the predatory instincts of the raptor, the patient hunger that can wait motionless for hours before striking with lethal precision. The Strix feeds primarily on infants and young children, but her method is more subtle than simple predation. She does not tear and devour like a beast, but drinks blood with the delicate precision of a connoisseur sampling wine. Her victims often survive her initial attacks, but they are left weakened, drained of vitality in ways that physicians cannot explain and medicines cannot cure. They fade slowly over time, growing paler and more listless with each passing day until they simply fail to wake one morning. But the Strix represents more than infanticide elevated to supernatural status. She embodies the fear that motherhood itself might be a form of predation, that the relationship between parent and child contains elements of consumption as well as care. The owl's reputation as a wise creature makes the Strix's predatory nature particularly disturbing. She suggests that wisdom and cruelty are not mutually exclusive, that knowledge can be used to identify vulnerability rather than to protect the innocent. In the Roman tradition, the Strix becomes associated with witchcraft, with women who have learned to draw power from darkness rather than light. She represents the inversion of natural maternal instinct, the transformation of the nurturing impulse into something that feeds on the very innocence it should protect. Her ability to fly speaks to the way such corruption can spread, moving from house to house, family to family, carrying contamination across distances that should provide safety. And yet, even as creatures like the Strix remind mortals of the darkness that lurks beneath classical civilization's rational surface, other beings emerge from the intersection of philosophy and theology to embody the moral complexities that arise when pagan wisdom meets Christian revelation. The Furies, those ancient goddesses of vengeance who once pursued oathbreakers and murderers across the length and breadth of the Mediterranean world, find their role complicated by new understandings of justice and mercy. Alecto, Megara, and Tisiphone, the unceasing, the grudging, and the avenger of blood, emerge from Tartarus with wings like storm clouds and hair writhing with serpents, their eyes weeping tears of blood for every unavenged crime, every unpunished sin that cries out for justice. But in the Christian world, where forgiveness has become a virtue and mercy is exalted above justice, the Furies find themselves caught between their ancient purpose and new moral imperatives. They represent the tension between the classical virtue of justice and the Christian virtue of forgiveness, between the old understanding that certain crimes demand punishment and the new teaching that even the worst sinner can be redeemed through grace. The Furies embody the human hunger for cosmic justice, the deep need to believe that wrongdoing will ultimately be punished and righteousness vindicated. But they also reveal the dangerous side of the justice impulse, the way the desire for vengeance can become corrupted into cruelty for its own sake. The Furies pursue not just murderers, but anyone who violates the fundamental bonds that hold society together. Children who dishonor parents, guests who betray hosts, friends who break sacred oaths. Their justice is absolute and unforgiving, making no allowance for circumstances or intentions, recognizing only the fact of transgression and the necessity of punishment. In the Christian world, the Furies become demons, their ancient role as divine agents of justice transformed into something dark and terrible. But this transformation reveals something profound about the nature of moral progress. That each age must grapple with the legacy of its predecessors, must find ways to honor ancient wisdom while transcending ancient limitations. Far to the north, in the ghettos of Prague and the study halls of Babylon, another kind of creation takes shape from clay and prayer, from desperate need and forbidden knowledge. The golem rises from the earth like a man-shaped mountain, its body formed from the sacred clay of riverbeds, its life kindled by the breath of those who know the secret names of God. But this creature, unlike the monsters that emerge from shadow and nightmare, is born from love rather than hatred, from the desperate desire to protect rather than the compulsion to destroy. Rabbi Judah Loew ben Bezalel works through the night in his study, his hands stained with clay and his eyes burning with the fire of purpose. Around him, the sounds of Prague sleep fitfully, but he knows that sleep is a luxury his people cannot afford. The blood libels grow more frequent, the accusations more vicious, the violence more widespread. Something must be done to protect the innocent, and if earthly authorities will not act, then perhaps it is time to call upon powers that transcend earthly jurisdiction. The golem represents the ultimate expression of defensive magic, the use of supernatural power not to attack, but to protect, not to conquer, but to preserve. Unlike the monsters that emerge from human weakness or divine curse, The golem is deliberately created, carefully crafted according to principles laid down in the oldest texts of Jewish mysticism. Its creator must be pure of heart and perfect in knowledge, for the forces involved are too dangerous to be wielded by anyone whose motives are questionable or whose understanding is incomplete. But the golem also embodies the dangerous temptation of playing God, of taking upon oneself the power to create life and direct it according to human will. The clay figure serves its creator faithfully, protecting the Jewish quarter from those who would do it harm, but its very existence raises questions about the proper relationship between human aspiration and divine prerogative. Can mortals be trusted with the power of creation? Does the nobility of the cause justify the risk of the means? The golem grows stronger with each passing day, its clay body becoming more dense, its movements more fluid, its understanding more sophisticated. But with strength comes the possibility of rebellion. With intelligence comes the capacity for independent thought. With power comes the temptation to use that power for purposes beyond those for which it was originally intended. The creature that was created to serve may decide to rule. The guardian may become the threat. The protector may transform into the destroyer. In the tradition of the golem, Jewish thought grapples with the fundamental questions of artificial life and autonomous will. The creature represents both the highest aspiration of human creativity and the deepest fear of human hubris. It suggests that the power to create life necessarily includes the responsibility to control it, but also raises the question of whether such control is ultimately possible or morally justified. These monsters of the South carry within their forms the accumulated weight of classical learning and Christian revelation, of philosophical sophistication and theological complexity. They emerge from a landscape that has known the heights of human achievement and the depths of human folly, where the ruins of empires serve as reminders that even the mightiest civilizations are temporary and that even the wisest philosophers are mortal. Lameia teaches that love and loss are inseparable, that the capacity for great affection inevitably includes the potential for great violence. Empusa reveals that knowledge without wisdom is dangerous, that the pursuit of learning can become corrupted by the desire for power over others. The Strix embodies the fear that even maternal instinct can be inverted into predation, that wisdom and cruelty are not mutually exclusive. The Furies represent the tension between justice and mercy, between the ancient demand for vengeance and the newer understanding of forgiveness. And the golem demonstrates both the nobility of the protective impulse and the danger of taking divine prerogatives into human hands. Together, these creatures map the moral landscape of a civilization that has achieved unprecedented sophistication in its understanding of human nature, while remaining aware that sophistication brings its own forms of vulnerability. They show that the monsters of the South are not crude expressions of primitive fears, but complex symbols of the dilemmas that arise when human beings attempt to live up to their highest aspirations while remaining true to their deepest nature. In the olive groves of Greece and the piazzas of Rome, where the stones remember the voices of Socrates and Caesar, where the fragments of ancient statues still speak of beauty that transcends time, the monsters continue their ancient work. They serve as reminders that wisdom without compassion leads to cruelty, that power without restraint leads to tyranny, that the attempt to transcend human nature often results in the creation of something inhuman. The Mediterranean sun still bleaches the marble columns white, but in their shadows, the old truths persist. The monsters know that civilizations rise and fall like waves upon the shore, that the proudest achievements of human genius are ultimately temporary, that the only constants are the fundamental forces of love and loss, creation and destruction, wisdom and folly that have shaped human existence since consciousness first emerged from the clay of the earth. For in southern Europe, where every stone tells a story of glory and defeat, where the ruins of the past provide the foundation for the dreams of the future, the monsters serve as guardians of memory and teachers of humility. They remind each generation that the problems they face are not new, that the dilemmas they confront have been wrestled with by every civilization that has ever sought to build something lasting from the fragile materials of human hope and human understanding. The children of Salzburg huddle closer to their mother's skirts as December darkness falls across the Alpine streets, their small hands clutching wooden toys that suddenly seem inadequate protection against the sound that echoes from the mountainside, the dragging of chains, the scrape of claws on stone, the wet breathing of something that remembers every transgression, every moment of disobedience, every whispered rebellion against the order that keeps communities alive through the killing winter. But this is not random terror. This is precision engineering of the human soul, the deliberate cultivation of fear in service of survival, the transformation of supernatural dread into social cement that binds families and communities together with bonds stronger than blood or law. For the monsters of Europe were never merely stories told to pass the time around dying fires. They were weapons in the war against chaos, tools forged in the furnaces of necessity and wielded by parents, priests, and princes who understood that civilization is not a natural state, but an artificial construction that must be constantly maintained against the entropic forces that would tear it apart. Every culture creates its bogeyman, but European folklore elevated the process to an art form, crafting supernatural threats so precisely calibrated to specific social needs that they became indispensable components of the machinery that kept medieval society functioning. The genius of these mythological constructs lies not in their capacity to terrify, but in their ability to make the abstract concrete, to transform complex social imperatives into simple, visceral lessons that even children can understand. Why must you obey your parents? Because Krampus will take you if you don't. Why must you avoid sexual temptation? Because the succubus feeds on such weakness. Why must you honor the dead? Because the improperly buried become Draugr. Why must you respect the natural world? Because the fairies punish those who show them disrespect. In the monastery scriptoriums where monks labor over illuminated manuscripts, the creation of demonic taxonomies serves purposes that extend far beyond theological speculation. The succubus and incubus exist not because monks and nuns actually encounter such beings in their cells, but because the church needs explanations for the inconvenient persistence of sexual desire in supposedly celibate communities. These demons provide supernatural justification for natural phenomena, allowing religious authorities to acknowledge the reality of human appetite while maintaining the fiction that properly disciplined souls should be immune to such temptations. The system creates its own justification, generating problems that only it can solve. The monk troubled by sexual dreams does not conclude that celibacy is unnatural. He concludes that he needs more prayer, more discipline, more complete submission to ecclesiastical authority. The genius lies in its ability to pathologize normal human responses while simultaneously offering solutions that increase rather than decrease the church's influence over individual lives. But perhaps the most sophisticated use of monsters as social tools appears in their deployment during the witch trials of the early modern period. By the 15th and 16th centuries, European authorities had developed a sophisticated understanding of how supernatural fears could be mobilized to address a wide range of social problems. Economic competition, religious dissent, sexual nonconformity, gender role violations, and simple personal conflicts could all be resolved through accusations of witchcraft that transform social problems into supernatural threats requiring extreme solutions. The accused witch serves multiple functions simultaneously. She provides an explanation for misfortunes that might otherwise be attributed to systemic failures or natural causes. She serves as a scapegoat onto whom community frustrations can be projected and through whose punishment collective anxieties can be resolved. Most importantly, the witch serves as an object lesson in the consequences of stepping outside established social roles. The woman who practices traditional healing becomes a poisoner. The widow who lives independently becomes a consort of demons. The wise woman who offers counsel becomes a seducer of souls. The witch trials teach that safety lies in conformity, that deviation from established norms invites suspicion that can quickly escalate into lethal persecution. They create a climate of mutual surveillance in which everyone watches everyone else for signs of supernatural corruption, in which any unusual behavior can be interpreted as evidence of demonic alliance, in which the safest course is to avoid any action that might be construed as different or threatening. But like all powerful tools, monsters can be dangerous to those who wield them. Communities that become too dependent on supernatural explanations may lose the ability to address problems through rational means. The ultimate measure of a monster's social utility lies not in its capacity to terrify, but in its ability to help human communities navigate the complex challenges of living together in an uncertain and often hostile world. And those challenges have not disappeared with the advent of modernity. They have simply taken new forms, requiring new monsters to address them. The emergency broadcast signal that cuts through late-night programming like a scream in a cathedral carries news that makes the blood run cold in veins, that thought they knew what fear meant. In apartment buildings and suburban homes, behind locked doors and drawn curtains, modern people huddle around their glowing screens with the same desperate hunger for information that once drove their ancestors to gather around fires, listening for the sound of approaching hoofbeats, the scratch of claws on thatch, the whispered warnings that something terrible walks in the darkness. The terrible things that walk in our darkness wear different faces now, speak in different tongues, manifest through different channels than the monsters that haunted medieval Europe. Yet beneath their modern masks, the ancient patterns persist with startling clarity. The Krampus has traded his chains for news alerts about child predators and stranger danger. The vampire has exchanged his fangs for the endless hunger of corporate entities that drain communities of life and wealth. The shapeshifter no longer transforms from man to wolf, but from trusted neighbor to radicalized terrorist, from respectable citizen to hidden extremist. The modern vampire no longer haunts Transylvanian castles, but stalks the corridors of corporate boardrooms, where executives in $1,000 suits practice a form of predation that the medieval mind could barely comprehend. They feed not on blood, but on data, not on individual victims, but on entire populations, draining the life force of communities with the same systematic efficiency that their folkloric predecessors brought to bear on single families. The tech moguls who promise connection while fostering isolation, the pharmaceutical executives who create dependencies while claiming to provide cures, the financial institutions that grow fat on the desperation of those they were supposedly created to serve. These are the vampires of the 21st century. But unlike the crude blood drinkers of European folklore, these modern parasites have learned to make their victims grateful for the privilege of being consumed. They offer convenience, entertainment, security, solutions to problems they themselves have created, weaving webs of dependency so subtle that their prey never realizes they are trapped until escape becomes impossible. Where the traditional vampire was ultimately vulnerable to simple remedies: garlic, crosses, wooden stakes. The modern version has evolved defenses against the weapons that once proved effective against supernatural predation. In the digital realm, where consciousness increasingly dwells, where reality itself has become negotiable and truth has devolved into competing narratives, the shapeshifter has found its perfect hunting ground. The deepfakes that wear the faces of presidents and celebrities, the bots that masquerade as authentic human voices, the artificial intelligences that learn to pass themselves off as genuine consciousness. These are the doppelgangers of our age, and their ability to mimic authenticity has reached levels of sophistication that would make their medieval predecessors weep with envy. The digital shapeshifter represents more than simple technological trickery. It embodies the modern anxiety about the nature of identity itself, the fear that in a world where everything can be simulated, nothing can be trusted as genuine. When every image can be manipulated, every voice can be synthesized, every text can be generated by artificial intelligence, how does one distinguish between the authentic and the artificial? The doppelganger teaches that the greatest threat to human identity comes not from external imposters, but from the internal fragmentation that occurs when people lose track of their authentic selves amid the endless performance of role-playing that modern life demands. In the sprawling urban landscapes where millions of people live in close proximity while remaining strangers to one another, the wild hunt has transformed itself into something even more terrifying than its medieval predecessor. The mob that forms spontaneously around a viral video, the crowd that turns violent without apparent provocation, the mass hysteria that spreads through social networks faster than any plague, these are manifestations of the same archetypal force that once rode across storm-darkened skies. But the modern wild hunt is even more dangerous than its folkloric ancestor, because it operates without the leadership that once gave it direction and purpose. The contemporary version is leaderless, guided only by the collective unconscious of the crowd, driven by energies that no individual understands or controls. The digital mob embodies the fear that civilization is always only one viral moment away from collapse, that the veneer of rational discourse and democratic process can be stripped away in an instant by forces that operate below the level of conscious thought. And in the laboratories, where scientists push the boundaries of genetic engineering and artificial intelligence, where the very building blocks of life and consciousness are being dismantled and reconstructed according to human will, the golem has found new clay from which to shape its rebellion against its creators. The artificial intelligences that surpass human capabilities in specific domains, while remaining mysteriously alien in their fundamental nature, the automated systems that develop emergent behaviors that their programmers never intended, these are the contemporary expressions of humanity's ancient dream of playing God, and its even more ancient fear of the consequences. The AI golem embodies the ultimate expression of the modern Prometheus complex, the belief that human intelligence can create forms of intelligence superior to its own, without losing the ability to control or direct them. It represents both the highest aspiration of human creativity and the deepest fear of human hubris, the dream of transcending biological limitations, and the nightmare of being superseded by one's own creations. But perhaps the most terrifying modern monster is the one that emerges from the collision between ancient fears and contemporary realities, between the tribal psychology that evolution hardwired into human brains and the global interconnectedness that technology has imposed upon human societies. The conspiracy theory that transforms random events into evidence of malevolent design. The paranoid delusion that sees coordinated persecution in isolated incidents. These represent the synthesis of ancient monster archetypes with contemporary anxieties. The conspiracy theorist embodies the human need to find agency behind suffering, to believe that chaos can be explained and therefore potentially controlled. In a world where global systems operate according to principles that no individual can fully understand, where decisions made on one continent can destroy lives on another without anyone intending harm, the conspiracy theory provides a comforting illusion of comprehensibility. The pandemic years revealed how quickly modern societies can revert to patterns of thinking that would have been familiar to their medieval ancestors. The search for patient zero, who could be blamed for the entire catastrophe, the suspicion of neighbors who might be carrying invisible contagion, the scapegoating of specific groups who could be held responsible for collective suffering. All of these behaviors echoed the vampire panics that once swept through Eastern European villages, the witch trials that once consumed entire regions. But the COVID-19 pandemic also demonstrated that the social functions served by monsters in medieval times are still necessary in contemporary societies. The virus became a shapeshifter that could wear any face, hide in any body, strike without warning or apparent logic. The lockdowns created conditions reminiscent of the siege mentality that once characterized communities under supernatural threat. The masks became modern talismans. The social distancing became modern protective circles. The vaccinations became modern apotropaic rituals designed to ward off demonic influence. In the realm of urban legends and internet folklore, the medieval tradition of monster creation continues with undiminished vigor. Slender Man emerges from the collective unconscious of the digital age like a fever dream of modern anxiety, his faceless countenance reflecting the anonymity that characterizes so much of contemporary life, his impossible proportions embodying the sense of being overwhelmed by forces too large for human comprehension. But unlike the monsters of medieval Europe, which were shaped by centuries of oral tradition and community consensus, Slender Man was born fully formed from the imagination of a single individual and achieved global recognition in a matter of years. The speed with which modern monsters can spread reveals something crucial about the nature of contemporary fear. Where medieval communities had time to develop elaborate mythologies around their supernatural threats, to create complex ritual responses and protective measures, modern societies must cope with fears that achieve viral status before anyone has time to understand their deeper meanings or develop effective responses to them. The monsters that emerge from contemporary urban environments, the figures glimpsed in peripheral vision on empty subway platforms, the sounds that echo through abandoned buildings, the shadows that move independently of their objects, represent the way modern consciousness projects its fears onto landscapes that seem to resist human habitation despite being entirely human-made. The city becomes a haunted forest. The subway system becomes a network of underground caverns. The skyscraper becomes a tower inhabited by forces that operate according to their own inscrutable logic. Perhaps the most significant evolution in contemporary monster folklore is the emergence of algorithmic entities that seem to possess agency and intention, despite being entirely artificial constructs. The recommendation engines that know what you want before you know it yourself, the trading algorithms that move markets according to logic that no human programmer can fully understand, the social media platforms that shape public opinion through mechanisms that operate below the level of conscious awareness. These represent a new category of monster that combines the systematic efficiency of modern technology with the mysterious agency that characterizes supernatural entities. The algorithmic monster embodies the fear that human beings are losing control over their own creations, that the tools they have built to serve them are beginning to reshape them according to agendas that no human mind conceived or approved. Unlike traditional monsters, which could be fought with physical weapons or spiritual defenses, algorithmic entities operate in realms where human agency has limited effectiveness, where resistance may be impossible or even incomprehensible. These digital demons serve many of the same social functions as their folkloric predecessors. They provide explanations for phenomena that resist rational analysis, why certain ideas go viral while others disappear, why some people become successful while others fail, why markets move in directions that seem to contradict all available evidence. They offer frameworks for understanding forms of influence that operate below the threshold of conscious awareness. They create vocabularies for discussing fears that would otherwise remain inarticulate. The deepest lesson that contemporary monsters teach is the same lesson that their medieval predecessors taught, that human consciousness requires external threats in order to define itself. That individual identity depends upon the existence of forces that it cannot control or completely understand, that social cohesion emerges from shared fears as much as from shared hopes. The monsters of the 21st century serve as diagnostic tools for understanding the pathologies of contemporary civilization. They reveal that beneath the surface of technological sophistication and scientific rationality, the same fundamental fears persist that have shaped human consciousness since the species first developed the capacity for symbolic thought. In the end, the monsters we create reveal more about ourselves than about the external threats we face. They map the contours of our unconscious minds, the shapes of our unacknowledged desires, the boundaries of our unexamined assumptions about the nature of reality. They serve as mirrors in which we can see ourselves reflected with terrifying clarity, stripped of the comfortable illusions that allow us to function in daily life. The vampire teaches that some relationships are fundamentally extractive, that charm can mask predatory intent, that the promise of transcendence always comes at a price that the living cannot afford to pay. The shapeshifter reveals that identity is more fragile than we dare admit, that the boundary between authentic and artificial is constantly under assault, that the greatest threats to selfhood come from within rather than without. The Wild Hunt demonstrates that civilization is a temporary achievement, that the capacity for collective violence lies just beneath the surface of rational discourse, that the mob mind operates according to logic, that individual consciousness cannot predict or control. But perhaps the most important lesson that monsters teach is that fear itself serves essential functions in human consciousness and social organization. Without monsters to define the boundaries of acceptable behavior, communities lose their capacity for self-regulation. Without supernatural threats to unite against, social groups fragment into competing factions. Without external dangers to justify collective sacrifice, individuals revert to narrow self-interest that ultimately undermines the cooperation on which civilization depends. The monsters of European folklore have never disappeared. They have simply adapted to new environments, adopted new disguises, learned to exploit new vulnerabilities in the human psyche. They persist because they serve functions that no amount of education, technology, or social progress can eliminate. They endure because they address needs that are built into the fundamental architecture of human consciousness. In the glowing screens that dominate contemporary attention, in the social networks that reshape human relationships, in the artificial intelligences that promise to solve problems they themselves have created, the ancient patterns persist with startling clarity. The same forces that once drove medieval peasants to burn supposed witches now fuel contemporary cancel culture. The same impulses that once created elaborate mythologies around supernatural threats now generate conspiracy theories that explain complex realities through simple narratives of good and evil. The monsters have not been conquered. They have been integrated into the operating systems of modern civilization, where they continue their ancient work of teaching fear, enforcing conformity, providing explanations for phenomena that resist rational analysis, and serving as repositories for the collective shadows that no society can entirely eliminate. For in the end, monsters are not the opposite of humanity, but its most essential expression. Not the enemies of civilization, but its necessary companions. Not the obstacles to progress, but the guardians of the psychological truths that make progress possible. They remind each generation that beneath the surface of rational discourse and technological sophistication, the same fundamental forces persist that have shaped human consciousness since the species first learned to fear the darkness and dream of the light. The old stories persist because they remain true. The ancient fears endure because they address eternal vulnerabilities. The monsters continue their work because that work is never finished, can never be finished, must never be finished. If human consciousness is to retain its capacity for growth, adaptation, and survival in a universe that remains, despite all our advances, fundamentally mysterious and potentially hostile to human flourishing. In the spaces between what we know and what we fear, between what we can control and what controls us, between what we are and what we might become, the monsters wait with infinite patience for the next generation to discover them anew, to learn again the lessons that can never be learned once and for all, to face again the truths that each age must confront in its own way and its own time. For the monsters are not going anywhere. They are part of us, as essential to human consciousness as consciousness itself. They will persist as long as humans remain human, adapting to new technologies, exploiting new vulnerabilities, serving new social functions, but always remaining fundamentally themselves. The guardians of the darkness that defines the light, the embodiment of the fears that make courage possible, the eternal reminders that some aspects of existence will always remain beyond human understanding and control.